And then of course we take a seat and all go from there. And of course we have with us this production of Zorba's director and musical director Walter Bobby and Rob Berman and the adapter of the book John Wiseman. Josh Prince here, the host of Josh Prince, if you're anywhere, come on up. Choreographer. And this cast are changing their clothes, and some of them will be down to entertain you and answer questions and have interesting things to say. But as usual, I'm going to turn to the man with the most interesting things to say, Mr. Kimball, to my right. 1968 was an interesting year, was it not?
It was, and I dare say most of you were around, weren't you? Are you going to help me out? All right, I'll run down some of the highlights of what was a very difficult year in the world. The Vietnam War, Tet Offensive. Lyndon Johnson declared he would not run for another term.
Are we applauding LBJ or the decision?
I don't know, they're not clear, but you know what they're involved.
Yes.
In April, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis. In June, Robert Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles. It was a very, very tough year. The Chicago Convention. The Chicago Democratic Convention, there were riots. In Czechoslovakia, massive turmoil in the Russian takeover. Great. Richard Nixon narrowly defeated Newt Humphrey in the election. How people cheer for that? Not many of you knew. The Kerner Commission issued its report on civil disobedience, of which there was a great deal. There was student upheaval at Columbia University. There was student unrest in Paris. There's probably student unrest just about everywhere. On the more positive side, Sheridan's Gateway Arch was finished in St. Louis. Movies, Kubrick's 2001 Space Odyssey, Graduate, Thomas Crown Affair. Among the notable deaths, the great socialist Norman Thomas, the amazing, incomparable Tallulah Bankhead, Helen Keller, and the great astronaut from the Soviet Union, Yuri Gagarin. Jackie Kennedy married Aristotle Onassis. Songs, Hey Jude, Those Are the Days, and Mrs. Robinson, and more. Come on. I'm not going to, I will tell you, the two top grossing shows at the time were, here, oh no. The two top grossing shows in the later weeks of 1968, not 64. You know what? Come on. Yes, number one, Promises, Promises. And number two was Zorba. Yay. All right, the show, and Richard will correct me if I'm wrong on facts. It started in New Haven about a week there, you remember that? He's going to tell us a lot about the show. Then 3 weeks in Boston. The book, as you know, is by Joseph Stein, adapted from the novel World of the Greek by Nikos Kazantzakis, music by our friend John Kander, and lyrics by the remarkable Fred Ebb. Directed by Harold Prince, choreography by Ron Field, scenic production Boris Aronson, costumes Patricia Ziprot, music director Harold Hastings, orchestrations Don Walker, produced by Harold Prince and his accomplice Ruth Mitchell. They did them all back then. You know who was in the original cast? Who? Herschel Bernardi, yes. Number one. Maria Carnella was Hortense, yes. John Cunningham was Nikos, very good. That's 4 out of 5. Lorraine Sarabian, who was the widow? Carmen Alvarez. I don't need to be here. It's every time.
Pointless talk.
You know, what am I doing here? Songs were replaced on the road. I won't go into all that. A few songs were cast on the road, including Joan Jett and Sheena Rivera. Yeah, it was a lot. And the show ran 305 performances in New York. It wasn't bad, not great, but pretty good. And later, it was a revival that ran longer than the original. In 1983 with Anthony Quinn, Rita Pegrova, Debbie Shapiro, believe it or not, Robert Westenberg. These were 1968, 83. Wake up. Wake up. We're all listening. I think that's enough. Do you want more?
Let's see from Richard if you got more.
Come on, Richard.
More.
It's your turn.
Well, you brought up something that's interesting. The night Zorba opened in New Haven in 1968, a year before that opening night, Al had discovered an Israeli folk singer, or cabaret singer. He'd seen her in a nightclub, and he was very impressed with her. She was young. And he approached her and said, look, I'm working on a show. It's a year away, but if you'll keep yourself free to do it, I'm now offering you the role. And the role was the leader. And the leader was his own invention. It wasn't in the novel, and it wasn't in the movie, the one with Anthony Quinn. And the leader was the character that Hal conceived, and it was that character that got Evan Kander to agree to do the show. Because when he first approached them about doing Zorba, they didn't want to do it. They didn't quite know how to get into it musically, and it was the word, the leader, and his explanation of how he intended to use it that attracted them to it. But the night it opened in New Haven, a year later, after Hal had asked this girl to remain free, she was in rehearsal, she opened in it, and she asked permission to go to New York the next morning because a friend of hers was getting married. And she didn't want to miss that. And they gave her permission to do it, provided she got back to New Haven by 2 o'clock, because they had a matinee on Saturday. Well, 2 o'clock came and went, she wasn't there. Lorraine Sarabian, whom you remember, was the understudy. She hadn't had any rehearsals, because you don't have time before the New Haven opening. And she had learned the role on her own, and she played the matinee on Saturday, finished the first act. The young lady arrived at the theater expecting to go on in the second act, said to the stage manager, I'm sorry I couldn't make it. The wedding took longer than I thought it would. And when Hal Prince heard that, he let her go. And Lorraine played for the rest of the run in New York. The young lady, I think, was paid for the entire run because she had a run-to-play contract, but she never played the part again. That's about the only trouble this agency. Whenever there's a problem out of town, the clients usually call the agent and say, come up here, man. But that was a very harmonious production, and I don't have any other bits of gossip and information for you. The only other point I'll make, if I have another second, because I think it's interesting. Kander and Ebb were young once, as weren't we all, and they didn't know each other, and they were writing with other people. Fred Ebb was working with a man named Paul Klein, and had written several musicals with him, including one that the Phoenix Theater produced called Morning Sun. And John Kander had just arrived from Kansas City, was trying to get going, and worked with two very old dear friends from back home named James and William Goldman. And together they wanted to do a musical based on The Enchanted by Girardot. That's how I met John Kander. They played this audition for a number of agents. That story isn't relevant, but I was very impressed with him. And so I asked him to become a client of mine, because I was a young agent as he was a young writer. And Fred Ebb had come to me with his partner Paul Klein and played some songs for me. And I was crazy about them both. Long story, very short, there came a time when both of them needed a collaborator, because Paul Klein decided to leave the business. He was having children and he needed more stability. And the Goldmans, of course, had become very important writers, but they didn't want to do more musicals. So there was John with no lyricist and Fred with no composer. And I thought, this could work. So I took Fred to see A Family Affair, which was the musical John wrote with the Goldmans. It was not a hit. It ran about 9 weeks. It didn't do too well. And we went to a snowy matinee in the beginning of the run. It's half filled. The theater wasn't crowded. The response was okay. But at the end of the show, I'll never forget the words. I couldn't improve on them. Fred looked at me and said, "Yeah, I could work with him." For the next 40-odd years, they did. And that's the end of that story.
There it is. You can't believe how inept I am at this. I can't see in either direction. Well, that's wonderful to know how this all started. I actually forced my parents to take me to see A Family Affair for my 13th birthday. And it had nothing to do with John Kander, who became a great hero of mine, but because the show starred Shelley Berman, who was a very popular comedian at the time and had really one of the first big comedy records. He made phone calls, one-way phone calls, and come out of the Second City. And I saw the show twice, and we keep thinking about it here. It's not a good enough show, unfortunately, but it sure has some great music.
There's
It's
some
wonderful
songs.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll do it. What the hell? Let me turn to Walter Bobby, who was the first person I spoke to about Zorba after Rob Berman actually suggested that we take seriously the idea of doing it. Walter, you've been involved in various Zorbas. This is the first one, I guess, that's ever made it all the way onto the stage. That there was talk of revisions and revivals and whatever. So tell us a little bit about it and your approach here.
I've always been intrigued by this material, by this story, because I find it very passionate, very dark. I don't remember, I think you announced the season, I called you immediately and said, "Can I do it?" Actually.
That's pretty much what happened, yeah.
Because something like that. I was approached about doing a commercial production several years ago, and so I read the novel, I saw the film, and I studied the 60s version, and then the Anthony Quinn version, and since then, there had been a new adaptation, also by Joe Stein, based on a workshop that they did with Ben Harris about 4 years ago. And the scripts were wildly different, and I thought it was difficult to wrangle it all into a commercial production, because I don't think that we would have had the kind of, because Joe had passed, and we didn't have the original writer, so there was not the kind of work that we could do on the script that I felt was comfortable. So would have been a comfortable process for either Kander, Ed, or the remarkable Joe Stein. So I said, I think we should do this now. And then when Jack announced it, I just wanted to run this material, because I've always had a fondness. I remember seeing the film and being devastated by its darkness, its passion, its power. And I find some of this score incredibly lush and romantic and passionate. There's some sweeping, I mean, every time I hear, "Why Can't I Speak?" my heart just swells. It's just a great, great aria. So I just jumped at the chance to come in and call my friend John Wyman and see if we could wrangle this thing, because I know at Encores we do a lot of fun stuff. Everybody loves when we come out and tap dance. But in the concert version, it's very difficult to engage people in a narrative, in a story. So the challenge here was to try to not just get, as we often do, quickly to the next number, but to see if we can engage the audience in this story. And we've done some scenes that are longer than we've ever done at Encores, because they were necessary in order to tell all the complex layers of the story. And that was a great joy for Rob and I and John.
Great. Given what you just said about John and the adaptation, I think I would normally turn this over to Rob, but let John say a word or two first, so we can sort of tell the story, so to speak, and then we'll talk about the music.
Yeah, this was a really, really important and interesting project for me. I mean, Walter remembers calling Jack when it was announced. I actually remember calling Walter when it was announced to see if he was going to do it. Usually when you announce an adaptation, I've done 3 or 4 here, the main task is to thin things out and provide just enough book material so that the songs will land, the emotional content of the songs will land when we get to them, because it's about the orchestra and it's about the score. When Walter and I first started to talk about this, he said, you know, there are 3 or 4 versions of the script. And I said, I didn't know that. And I took a look at it. There was a Broadway version, there was a touring version of the Broadway show. Then there was the script for the Anthony Quinn revival, and then, as Walter said, a 4th one later on. And they were all Kander and Evan and Joe Stein's scripts, but they all had made a variety of different choices. And so in approaching the way to do this adaptation, we had an opportunity to do something sort of unusual, which was to pick and choose between a variety of choices that had been made in these scripts. I mean, for example, Pavli is the kid who commits suicide at the end of the first act, and that happens in every version. But the scene in which the villagers learn that he's killed himself and vow to take vengeance against the widow takes place in a different place in almost every one of these scripts. In one script, it's the end of the first act and it brings the curtain down. In another script, it is the first thing that happens in the second act. There were all these different choices, and in order to craft what's required here, which is a sort of a swift, streamlined version of the show, we had an opportunity to kind of pick and choose and move things around. That made this a really, really interesting and fascinating process. We have the song that the men sing when they come into the mine in the first act, because the changes were not just in the book, they were in the score as well. And the reprise that they sing is a song that does not exist on paper in any of the scripts. It was on the cast album that was done of the Quinn revival. So it was like that. We had all these bits and pieces. And it was fascinating. And I'm going to give this microphone up, but before I go, I just have to say, I'm a book writer, and I know Encores, it's about the music in the orchestra, but listening to Joe Stein's words come off this stage, the flavor and power and emotion of his work, I think is thrilling. It said this was a pleasure for that to be such an important part of this work.
I just want to say one thing. We were at the Sitzbro when the orchestra plays the score for the cast, and the cast first time sings. And we finished the Mine song, and John turned and he said, "Did I write that?" and I said, "Yes, you did." He said, "Really?" And we played it again. He said, "I still don't remember it. It sounds like South Pacific."
Score.
Well, just similarly, the original Broadway production, when it went on tour a year later with John Raitt, they revised the score, and we're very lucky that John Kander is still with us and advised us on this production. And there are certain things that he requested. For instance, the original production of the original cast of Widow of Washington, and then the revival, they rewrote it and they added a song that's a beginning that Nico sings, and that is part of that whole trio that we did today at the top of the second act. So in that case, John Kander said, that's the version, that's the final version of the show, that's the song we want there. So, in terms of what we do here at Encores, we're not going to go back to what they did on Broadway in that case, because John Kander's that second version, which he considers the show, the version of the score that the show is now, the finished version. In any case, we had 3 different versions of the orchestration to deal with, and this show, like John was describing with the script, with the score, there was a lot of work to do to kind of assemble and put it together for this particular production. But I've really grown deeply in love with the score. It's fascinating because there's really not any songs that sort of came out of the show that really lived on in their own right, as many standards and musical theater songs come out of these shows. But in a way, it's a testament to how appropriate and theatrical and effective the score is for this story and for these people and for this period. I think it's kind of a remarkable score, theatrical and rather sophisticated, even though there were no big hits that came out.
One of the other interesting things that happened at Sixth Grove was rehearsal where the orchestra and the cast come together for the first time, is that when John Turturro got up to sing his opening number, he said, "It's the first time I've ever sung with an orchestra in my entire life," which was wonderful and touching and great, and he did a fantastic job. So, I'm very curious about anything you want to say, but particularly about being in a musical, being on stage in a musical, which is a different kind of experience, I think.
Yes. Very good. Very, very good. But Walter and Rob have been really kind and helpful. It's really an honor and a privilege to be around so many talented people. And it's a new experience for me. It's one that I'm enjoying as I'm getting over my fear. I am enjoying it. Yes, I am.
Anybody else up here burning to say something before I turn it over to them and let them ask some questions? It's so great that so many of you came out here today. Such a great
One of the most unique experiences we've had in the process of this, well, first of all, I just have to say thank you to this remarkable cast. Zorba is a very, very difficult show to cast because it requires incredible actors to tell this story, and I just admire the cast completely. John's just exuberant and full-bodied humanity, and Zoe's fragile comic genius, and Santino's passion, and Elizabeth's agility and need. It's just been a wonderful experience, and Aaron just but I have to say, one of the most fun things about putting this together is when our casting director, Jay Binder, arranged the belly dancer auditions. And 10 or 12 gorgeous women from Queens came in, fully dressed, with their bellies exposed, and Sultana won the day.
Well, I don't know what to say after that. You know why we're all in this business. I'm sure people in the audience have questions. Do we have microphones out there? Do we not have microphones out there? We don't seem to have a microphone. Oh, we do have a microphone out there. Okay, so if you'd like to ask a question, please raise a hand. We don't see all that well from up here, but we'll try to find you, and microphones will try to find you. And there's a woman waiting there. Okay, we're on, and then we'll be. Whoever gets the microphone first, start your talk.
Winner? Okay, I'm over here. I'll stand up. Hi. The choreography is always terrific. I was just curious how different it might be if you had an extended rehearsal schedule. I'm just so aware of how much you're able to do in such a short amount of time. Would it be any different if you had a full rehearsal schedule, more difficult, more intricate? I'm just curious.
Josh is not here, right? So Walter can probably answer that.
We in this compressed encore situation, there was a huge amount of dance music which we could not use, especially going into Canio. That dance is probably 3 times as long. It's a big mid-first act number. The other thing that we felt in terms of telling the story is that there were certain kinds of dance in several of the productions that didn't help our narrative. For example, there was a miners dance, and I just ridiculously want to see these miners jump up with their pickaxes and twirl around and seem incomprehensible to me and not helpful to this little sort of crude village in Crete. So we cut the miners dance, but yes, there was more choreographic thing. I think that what Josh Rhodes got done in 9 days is remarkable.
The only thing I wanted to say is, what show did the New York Times see? Because this was fabulous.
He still
Was the New York Times
that he saw in his head before he came, and that's the show he reviewed.
You know, I spent 7 years as an overnight theater critic early in my life. You know, the devil's servant. And they do their job and we do our job. And, you know, they have their opinions and we are putting on our show for our audience. And what can I tell you? They make mistakes. Sometimes even we make mistakes. We really don't do this show or any show to make the New York Times happy. The New York Times has its own thing, and we have our own thing. We're encores. There's only one encores, and encores we must be.
I wanted to tell you this because if there are any young writers out there, take heed. When we were all very young, Kander and Ev and I, you could go in the golden age of Broadway, as we like to call it, to many, many, many producers. There were 10 or 12 of them who produced musicals almost exclusively and did them almost every year. So there were a number of them that were always willing to listen to new teams. And what would happen is you took the two guys to a producer's office and they played songs for him. They could be songs that were written on spec or plays that were not even going to be musicals, just to give an example of what they would do with theater and music. So I took John and Fred to see the great and unique David Merrick. Before they had Cabaret on. I think Florida Red Menace may have been running, but they weren't established yet. And they played for him. They did 8 or 10 songs and they left, and I stayed behind, as agents do, to say, well, Mr. Merrick, what did you think? They're all right, but they're not theater writers. And I swear to you, that's exactly what he said, and he held up the score. He said, this is a theater score. It turned out to be it was called I Do, which is the one he was going to do next. But they were dismissed. Now, I think if I'd ever told them what he said, John would have been fine, but I think Fred probably would never have written again. Because he didn't take well to that kind of negative. And the point is, when Cabaret opened and kind of established them, the first one on the phone was Merrick, saying, I'd like them to do the Happy Time for me. And I told them that, and they liked the idea. So they said, if he wanted us, we'll do it. But we can't do it until after we finish Zorba. Because, as Hal Prince always did, the day after a show opens, he talked about the next one, whether it was a success or not. As he had done with Cabaret. The Florida Red Menace opened, it was not a great success. The next day he offered them I Am the Camera, which became Cabaret. But the point is that Merrick did not like the idea at all of waiting until Hal Prince got clear. He wanted to do the show to come in after the success of Cabaret. It turns out he won because Zorba took a little longer to prepare. And so the Happy Time opened in January of 1968, and Zorba opened in November. But the point is, he didn't remember because sometimes the things we don't want to remember are too painful to forget, whatever that was. But he had heard them and dismissed them. And when they became themselves, he was on the phone the next day. Sorry, Mr. Merrick, it's the truth.
Hi, I have a question for John Turturro.
Hold on 1 second here. I'm just going to add a PS about the critics. I was one for a while. Not terrible. And you don't know enough. I remember saying to Richard Rogers once that I needed to see a show at least twice. I got a feel for it, you got a sense for the score, and he looked at me and said, I was crazy. He figured, you know, his musical skill, you could do it on one hearing. But the problem is they don't know enough. They don't know all the work that goes into making these shows. They have no clue of the choices that are made. They really don't. And so they come and they have an impression, and sometimes it isn't too superficial, but a lot of the things it really is. And I'm afraid that it's sad because so many artists are injured by this.
Hi, I have a question. This is a question for John Turturro. Do you feel that there's something in your educational background that made you a consummate performer, a consummate theater professional, John?
That's a big question. I guess if my,
Graduate studies, perhaps?
I think it was more sort of like kitchen table. The family that I came from. I was sort of the beginning of it, and then, you know.
Home when you were a kid, or
Yeah.
your wife was also an actress?
No, growing up when I was a kid.
Oh.
So, yeah, so, but, you know, I'm sure each of us have their own story in this row of people, you know, of why we do what we do, you know, but.
We're glad we could do it.
Oh, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Where are we? Right here from some other cast members. Sure. Santino.
Hello.
I think called on in chemistry class, right? You're just dozing a little bit. Not too much. And suddenly you hear your name.
What do you want to hear? What I want to say. Oh boy, this is the largest talkback I've ever been to. I'll say that. I want to take a picture of it. I do. No, I agree with. I've never done one of these. I do want to say when John was saying that this was a new experience for him being in a musical. It's also unlike any experience any of us have ever been in, either because it's 9 days of rehearsal, which is crazy. It's really, really, really fast, and unlike anything because of the way that we, you know, the orchestra's on the stage, so the stage, it's a lot. It's crazy. I was telling Zoe backstage, we were talking about sometimes it feels like we're being shot out of a cannon, but we don't know where we're gonna, like where we're heading, what country we're in once we get shot out. But it's a great group of people, and it's you know, it's exciting to see this score with this orchestra and to be able to play with these people. It's been great. It's been a great, crazy 9 days. Well, it's more than 9 days now. It's going to be 2 weeks by Sunday.
In case any of you are planning on coming back, which is always possible, between now and tomorrow night, I've been noticing something really interesting about this show that I just wanted to say purely because I noticed it, which is it's a story. The storyteller, basically the leader, comes out at the beginning and says, listen to this story. But I've been beginning to count the number of stories that need to get told within the story to get the story told. Some of them are songs, like the Admirals, the Butterfly. Some of them are speeches, some of them are, I'm up to 11. There's at least 11 different stories within the story. And I think that's such a fascinating approach to how to write a show. I've never seen anything quite like it, and I don't think anyone, I'm not even sure it was intentional, really, but I just started counting it because I get to see the show tonight, so I just thought I'd say that. Is there another question out there? No, I think we'll have to pack it in. Over here?
The original production, the leader was part of a bazooki circle. Why did you decide to not begin with the bazooki circle?
Because it would have been kind of ridiculous to have 30 musicians sitting in front of 30 other musicians. The original show had a circle of people who were all playing instruments. In fact, people played instruments throughout the show. The leader was often mostly followed by 2 guitar players. We don't have time to memorize and do all that in our time frame. So Josh had this wonderful idea that we would start with the sea and breath, which is what the essence of life is, and that we would reveal the orchestra. But actually, most of the original cast also played instruments, and we could not possibly do that. Maybe we should have hired John Doyle.
I knew I made a mistake somewhere. There's only one more. Yes.
One of the things I loved about this production is this is a play with music. It's not your typical musical comedy. And I love the fact that you honored it, and it's so well done. I can't thank you enough for being that smart.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for saying that. We've actually come to the end of our time, so hold those questions. You can ask the very same questions next year. Come back and see us next season. We appreciate you being here. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.